This is the Road to War Objective 2 about the advantages that the Union and the Confederacy each had going into the Civil War. But before that, let's take a look at our characters. The typical Union soldier was often referred to as Billy Yank, short for Billy Yankee. The typical Confederate soldier was called Johnny Reb, and the names Billy Yank and Johnny Reb were often used interchangeably between the soldiers themselves. One thing that the Yankees did write about a lot, though, in their journals was the rebel yell, which they said made the hair on the back of their neck stand up. Now, we don't have any recordings of this, obviously, but it was a really high-pitched, shrill scream that the Rebs would yell from their side of the battlefield or while they were hiding in the trees before a battle would start. It was meant to be intimidating, and by the records, it apparently was. But whether you were Billy Yank or Johnny Reb, you were fighting for a cause. If you were a Union soldier, your cause was just to do that, reunify the country, to bring it back into union as one, to reform the United States of America. That's what you wanted to do. And if you were a rebel, you were doing just that. You were rebelling against an oppressive government, the same as the heroes of the American Revolution had done. Of course, there was one notable difference. They were rebelling against the British. You were rebelling against the United States. And there are a couple of other things you have to understand about the Civil War as well. The first one being that this is not a strictly North versus South war, no matter how much people want to make it into that. The side that you fought on was often dictated by your political beliefs. You're either about restoring the Union or you're about states' rights, and that determined which side you fought for in the war. This is a rebels versus government war, not necessarily a North versus South war. In fact, the Union Army had 350,000 soldiers who were from southern states, and the Confederate Army had a lot of soldiers that were from northern states as well, because they believed in the cause of that army, not just being limited by geography. Family members often fought against each other in the war. It would be father versus son, or brother versus brother, cousin versus cousin, friend versus friend. People who had grown up in the same towns but didn't let that geography dictate which side they fought for. They based it on their political views. Even the generals on opposing sides had been, some of them were family members with each other. Lincoln's own in-laws fought for the Confederacy. Also, most of the generals had graduated together at West Point and fought together in the Mexican War of 1848. To these guys, the Civil War was almost like a test of wills, like a giant military scrimmage. And they respected each other, and they knew each other really well. Matter of fact, when Robert E. Lee died, a famous Confederate general, some of the pallbearers at his funeral had been Union generals they'd fought against in the war, because a lot of times these guys were friends who knew each other and now had to fight a war against each other. Okay, so we've established that it's not a North versus South war, it's a rebels versus government war. And in terms of resources, the government, or the Union, is going to have a pretty decided advantage. They've got a well-developed economy, and if you remember, the vast majority of the industries are in the North. They're the ones that have most of the railroads up here at that time. They have most of the factories at that time. So when you've got to produce more weapons and better weapons, and you've got to move those weapons and people to various sites on the battlefields, it's pretty easy to do using the rail networks. They had something like 80% of the factories and 80% of the railroads in the country at that time, as well as 75% of the nation's wealth and millionaires. They had 10 times as many soldiers as the CSA, many of them immigrants from Germany and Ireland who'd come over during the old immigration period. So they had a decided manpower advantage, and they also had a superior navy. They managed to block off southern ports and not let any imports in from Europe, while they were able to get some during that time as well. So in terms of resources, they have all the advantages. But they did have one major disadvantage, and that was leadership. Now, this is Ulysses S Grant, who's probably the most famous general for the North or the Union, I should say, in the Civil War, but he doesn't take command until 1864. Lincoln goes through a myriad of really not very competent generals before he gets to U.S. Grant. One guy, George McClellan, he fired, then brought him back, and then fired him again as the commander of Union forces. The Confederates, meanwhile, despite the fact that they really don't have the resources that the North has some advantages of their own. The number one being that they have the quote-unquote home field. Now, the majority of the war is being fought in the South down here, and over here, these are the Appalachian Mountains. Down in the Carolinas, they start being referred to as the Smokies, okay, because of low fog or because of low clouds and fog and things like that. If you grew up in that terrain and you knew how to fight in it, then that's a distinct advantage. And remember, the majority of the war is fought in the South. The Confederates are not really attacking the North, and there aren't that many battles in the North. The Union is basically coming down to try to tire the Confederates out. And the Confederates, you know, they knew this terrain. They knew where the caves were. They could deal with the heat in the summertime and the humidity. And if you've ever been down in the South during that time, you know what I'm talking about. Go down there as a guy from Maine and Massachusetts in a navy blue wool coat and tell me how that goes. Also was the fact that they were fighting a defensive war. Really, all they had to do was not surrender. If they could just hold on until the Union gave them their respect and their freedom, then they'd basically win. They didn't have to attack. They just had to not quit. Also, a lot of the Southerners, just by the conditions of living in the South and in the agricultural aspects, were used to a harder life and were natural fighters. These were all advantages that the Confederacy had. But they also had one really big advantage as well. And that was better generals, led by the brilliant Robert E. Lee of Virginia. Now, Lee had graduated near the top of his class at West Point. Ulysses S. Grant, by the way, decidedly had not. And Lincoln had asked him to head the Union Army, actually. But that was before Virginia seceded from the Union. Once Virginia left, Lee said, "I can't raise arms against my own state," and decided that he would fight for the Confederacy, even though he was not a really big advocate of slavery himself. Other brilliant Confederate generals included Stonewall Jackson, General Jeb Stuart, and George Pickett, famous for Pickett's charge in the Battle of Gettysburg. And frankly, they had their own little Mount Rushmore set up for them 10 minutes outside of Atlanta in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain is basically a giant bald rock that for centuries only had a couple of pine trees on it when you looked at it. But if you look here and you get a little closer to it, and I've been here, this is a pretty cool place, the Confederates have built their own little version of Mount Rushmore here. The site is a monument to the leaders of the Confederacy, most notably Jeff Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. But despite all the great leadership, there was a huge disadvantage that the Confederates couldn't shake, the resource advantage. Some soldiers didn't even have uniforms, only the officers did. They just had fought in their farming clothes. And the Union really had them beat in terms of resources across the board. But there were some things that weren't really advantages or disadvantages for anybody. It didn't matter if it was a Union camp or a Confederate camp. Life in the camp was not easy. Conditions were not sanitary. A lot of times you were eating hardtack that had been left over from the Mexican War of 1848 that had to be dunked in coffee to be softened and split apart. It was basically a really hard biscuit, and a lot of times it had maggots in it. For the most part, you didn't have a whole lot to do in camp besides play cards, instruments, just find ways to pass the time. In between battles, that is. And most of the time when you took prisoners of war, it wasn't necessarily that bad. The idea was you didn't harm them, you just didn't want the other side to have the manpower advantage, so you'd hold on to them till the end of the war. The conditions weren't always the cleanest in prisoner of war camps, but generally, you could survive and get by okay till the war was over. The one notable exception to that is Andersonville, Georgia, a Confederate prisoner of war camp that held Union soldiers. We'll talk about Andersonville a little bit later, but see that creek right there? That's what you use for drinking water and the latrine. And a lot of the soldiers in Andersonville often came out looking like this. Also, fighting style wasn't a particular advantage for either side. Fighting usually involved a front line of guys firing a musket at the other side while guys kneeled down behind them to load the next set of guns. You'd eventually just start walking toward your enemy until you got it into an eventual charge. You'd get a little closer, just really standing up and walking toward each other and firing at short range in a lot of cases with no real cover. And then it turned into a game of stab, twist, and drop with the bayonets. Basically, the fighting style of just standing above ground and walking toward each other as you're shooting each other until you got close enough to use your bayonets led to a tremendous amount of casualties, and 650,000 soldiers died in the Civil War on the battlefield. Speaking of field hospitals, those really weren't to any particular advantage to either side in the Civil War either. The tools and the conditions were barbaric at best. I mean, you can imagine you're out in the field, it's already muddy, it's already unsanitary, there's bacteria everywhere, and you're digging out a bullet or you're hacking off a limb and then just dipping the tools in water and moving on to the next guy. Now remember, this is before antiseptic. You go into a hospital now and you get that clean smell. That's antiseptic. That's getting rid of all the germs. That doesn't come out until 1865. Ironically enough, the final year of the Civil War. So you have all sorts of diseases that are getting spread from person to person just with blood on the tools as they either dip them in some water to wash them off or don't wash them off at all. And here's something gross. The South had the monopoly on cotton, so when they stitched their guys up, they'd use cotton thread. They denied the North cotton, obviously, so Northerners to stitch up their patients had to use copper filament, copper thread. Of course, amputations were very common. If you got a musket ball on the leg, you had to worry that infection would spread to the rest of your body and kill you. So using chloroform if you could get it, or just giving the guy some whiskey and putting a bullet in between his teeth, as the phrase bite the bullet goes, that might have to be the best you could do as you hacked a leg or an arm off. Yep, modern medicine at its finest right there. And if you were lucky, you just might get enough of the leg so that the infection didn't spread and you could be on to a happy life. With conditions like that, you wanted the Civil War to end as soon as possible with you victorious. 650,000 people died on the battlefield in the Civil War. You could see that from the fighting tactics as to why. And another twice as many died in Civil War field hospitals as a result of their wounds, and you could see that from the conditions. So the idea was you wanted to end it quick, and one of the best ways to do that was get the help of the British if you could. Now, when the war is going on, the British upper class supported the South. They needed their cotton, so they were willing to support them. But the British common man had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and often supported the Union because they wanted to see slavery end. The South badly needed British support, and they didn't get it. Britain, meanwhile, was privately supporting the South, but publicly supporting the North because British war industries were supplying both sides in the Civil War. The British had a surplus of cotton that lasted until around 1863, and eventually that cotton surplus ran out. British textile workers were unemployed by the cotton famine that was there, and so the Union started sending wheat and corn from northern farms to try to gain the British favor. Also, the Union started sending cotton taken from southern plantations to try to get them on their side as well. Basically, Britain needs what the North can give them. They don't need the South anymore, and that became a decided advantage for the Union. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot.